Our next session is titled Socio-Cultural Perspective on the issues that we discuss. And the discussion will focus on the public perception within Israel about international law, generally international tribunals in particular, and the relevant aspects. And for leading this discussion, we are very happy to have with us Dr. Amir Fakhoury. Amir is a Polonsky postdoctoral fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. He is both a lawyer and a sociologist, and he is very active in various aspects. In addition to his academic research, he also leads the Nissan project for the study of shared society at the Van Leer Institute, and also co-director of the partnership-based peace think tank, which focuses on developing and refining the paradigm of national partnership between the river and the sea, and many other activities. And Amir will open the discussion, and then after about 20-25 minutes of presentation, we will have a discussion. So Amir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Okay. Shalom Kulam. Hello to everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. So the title of my talk is Shmum, the cultural origins of the rejection of international law in Israel. Shmum reflects, as you probably know, widespread public and political skepticism in Israel toward international institutions. However, a more precise title for this lecture might have been the Hag Shmad, as coined recently by Minister Ben-Gvir as an expression of dismissal of the International Criminal Court. Shmum, as a concept, originates with Ben-Gurion and is widely discussed in academic literature as an expression of opposition to the legal, but mainly political constraints associated with membership in the largest international organization. This sentiment also resonates with Ben-Gurion's famous declaration, "Our future does not depend on what the Jews per se, but on what the Jewish do," and the phrase, "a nation that will alone." Ben-Gurion once elaborated on his meaning, saying, "As a member of the Jewish people, I say, all respect to the institution of the UN and its members, but as long as Isaiah's prophecy, nation should not lift up sword against nation, remains unfulfilled, and as long as our neighbors scheme to annihilate us, our security will depend solely on our own strength." In contrast, Moshe Sharet advocated for greater consideration of the constraints arising from Israel's membership in the UN. Many researchers argue that the difference in their position is semantic rather than substantive, since both camps emphasize Israel's strengths along the limits imposed by the international obligation. Today, however, I'm not focusing on Shmum, but rather, as I said, on the expression the Hag Shmad, which epitomizes disdain for international law, especially the laws of war and the humanitarian law. To illustrate, Minister Ben-Gvir reacted to the ICC's acceptance of South Africa petition with the following statement: Where was the international law during the Holocaust? The ICC anti-Semitic decision proved what we already know. This court is not seeking justice, but is targeting the Jewish people. They were silent during the Holocaust, and now they continue their hypocrisy and take it a step further. The Hag Shmad. We must not comply with decision that jeopardizes Israel's continued existence. And we must persist in crushing the enemy until absolute victory is achieved. When I shared this quote with a colleague, he remarked that one could write an entire book about the statements. Unfortunately for you, this lecture is merely a brief exploration, a series of hypotheses that need rigorous examination, particularly concerning causality. It's worth noting that the Prime Minister Netanyahu's response was markedly different, perhaps even the opposite of Ben-Gvir's. Netanyahu's statement stated, Israel is fighting the most just war. We will continue to do everything to defend our citizens while adhering to international law. I will address this contrast later. The thesis I will share today is that Hag Schmag is symptomatic of either a new cultural phenomenon or an aggravation of an old one. It is intimately tied to the adoption of a logic of decisive resolution toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and secondly, the emergence of a new wave of militarization in Israel. Legal scholars Tamar Brandis and Michal Cohen recently wrote, calls to disregard international law may garner support within Israel, but they do not serve Israel's interest in the international arena. Not all the international law is essential to safeguarding the core values of Israel. This assertion highlights the growing prevalence of calls to disregard international law and the apparent support that they receive within Israeli society. To what extent these calls are widespread and among whom they resonate are questions I will address later. Although I have conceded that I should have titled the lecture the Hag Schmag instead of Shmum, I stand by the second part of the title, the cultural origin of the rejection of international law in Israel. My aim is to explain that this phenomenon, or more precisely, to propose a series of informed hypotheses through cultural analysis rather than institutional, legal, or economic frameworks. This requires a brief explanation. Based on the cognitive approach to cultural studies, culture is understood as a toolkit, a repertoire of meaning, often contradictory, used by individuals to formulate strategies for action. This perspective differs from the idea that individuals passively exist within a singular all-encompassing culture. According to this view, culture provides a framework of constraints and opportunity, offering public meaning that facilitates certain behavior patterns and restrain others, making them available and accessible. In this sense, for example, sociologist Uri Ben Eliezer's book, War Instead of Peace, A Century of Nationalism and Militarism in Israel, served as a cultural analysis par excellence. Ben Eliezer demonstrates through the Israeli case that the relationship between culture, war, beliefs, values, ideologies, narrative, discourses, forms of speech, and representation. These elements, he argues, intensify conflict and increase the likelihood of war. In this view, war, even when it is continuous state policy, it is fundamentally rooted in culture. This brings us to the question, what is new here? Has a Hag Schmag become part of the Israeli cultural repertoire? Has it simply become more available within this repertoire, or are more people using it? These are three distinct but related cultural questions. If the answer is that it has become more accessible or merely more widely used, we are dealing with an epiphenomenon. In that case, we must identify the primary phenomenon from which this secondary manifestation derives. My research intuition suggests that this is a new phenomenon, a worsening of an old trend, but still novel. Its roots lie in what I termed the grand shift from a logic of conflict management to a logic of conflict resolution, decisiveness, as well as the new wave of militarization in Israel. However, even before this grand shift, the average Jewish Israeli, as a national subject shaped by mainstream Zionist socialization, had every reason to harbor a negative attitude toward international law. Legal philosopher Raif Israel captured this sentiment well. He writes, "Do not forget that Zionism embodies the mistrust in international law to deliver justice. If it had been effective, it would have ensured at least civil rights, such as physical and property protection for Jewish citizens in Europe. All of Zionism is founded on distrust of the promises of equality given the Jews in enlightened Europe. Justice presumes existence and securing that existence must come first. The phrase Zionism embodies mistrust international law is a bold statement, unlikely to be fully embraced even by the Israelis' most critical sociologists. Nonetheless, many would not dismiss it outright. There's a good chance that you're thinking right now that this echoes the same quote from Ben-Gvir, which has been said to deserve a book in itself. I will briefly mention the relevant part of it. Where was the international law during the Holocaust? When I refer to the grand transition to the thesis of a decisive victory, I mean the shift from a thesis of conflict management vis-a-vis the Palestinians to the thesis of decisive resolution. The conflict management thesis has taken various forms since the conflict began, from Jabotinsky's well-known Iron Wall logic through Oslo to the conflict reduction thesis, which was the most popular approach before October 7 and has since disappeared as if it never existed. No one illustrates the logic of decisive resolution better than Smotrich, who referenced the conflict management thesis as a contrast to his own vision of victory. In his infamous decisive plan, Smotrich stated, "The purpose of the decisive plan before you are no longer the prolonged management of conflict at varying intensities, but decisive resolution, no more dithering than cosmetic solution like chasing after mosquitoes, but draining the swamp and addressing the root of the problem to its very end." The phrase, coined and obsessively repeated by Prime Minister Netanyahu, "absolute victory," is also a reflection of this logic of a decisive resolution, which has become entrenched in the Israeli Jewish repertoire. This emerging logic of decisive resolution, combined with the new forms of militarization, has created a new cultural reality in which hug schmug has become a prevalent mindset. More precisely, it has turned the phrase into an acceptable expression for many in Israel, as identified with the two jurists I mentioned earlier. Let me explain the presumed causality underlying this development while elaborating what I mean by new militarization. In his book, Shooting and Crying, the New Militarization of Israel in the 2000s, military sociologist Yagil Levy examined how militarization processes in Israel underwent a fundamental shift in the 2000s, highlighting their impact on society, politics, and security ethos. This is a broad and profound thesis, one I recommend everyone here familiarize themselves with. However, given our limited time, I will focus only on aspects of this new militarization that I believe help explain the growing prevalence of Al-Shmar, of the cultural tool in the Israeli public discourse. Well, the first characteristic is the merging of the military with the political, where war is no longer a continuation of policy, but becomes simultaneously both a mean and an end. Following October 7, this mode of thinking, cultural as much as it is military or political, has intensified. As a result, the prospect of endless war is increasingly perceived as a reasonable possibility. Integrated into the cultural repertoire of Israel, integrated into the cultural repertoire, Israeli cultural repertoire, not as the sole possibility, but as an additional one within the sphere of cultural probability, if you will. Endless war, which presumably necessitates the creation of a Jewish Sparta, and as expressed by none other than the Prime Minister Netanyahu, cannot coexist with the limitation and constraints of international law. If war becomes an ideology and not merely a continuation of policy designed to serve an ideology, then the ideology inherently contradicts international law, which is meant to regulate war as a temporary and exceptional state. I will return to this argument as I address further characteristics of this new militarization. Levy also points out that the new militarization both feeds on and perpetuates ignorance. He writes, One feature of ignorance in the military realm is that violent spectacles captivate attention and divert focus from the broader context, what precedes the event and what followed it, creating ignorance as a key component in legitimizing the use of violence, as it facilitates its justification by stripping the action of the context in which it occurred. Thus emerge a discourse that directs public attention to the need to respond to violent acts preceding the use of force, thereby amplifying feelings of rage and a desire for revenge. This is not just about ignorance, but also about the lack of intellectual and emotional capacity to training to discuss context, which manifests as the denial of enmity. This brings us to the complex issue requiring sensitivity. Surely you have noticed that after October 7, any discussion of context was perceived as scandalous and unacceptable. Yet this response, born of a severe trauma, has reinforced the denial of enmity as context. Levy writes, again, once the root of enmity are identified, it becomes possible to engage in a political discourse about coming to terms with or addressing them. By framing its action as self-evident, detached from their historical context, imposed on Israel and therefore devoid of choice, Israel leadership denied its citizens the freedom to choose. One cannot truly understand this phenomenon without understanding what trauma is. In our context, Israel's society trauma is indeed profound, and it would be futile to attempt to explain the phenomenon where we are facing without adequately appreciating the magnitude of this trauma. A short walk through the streets of Jerusalem easily reveals the depth and persistence of this trauma, a trauma that has also bred intense hatred toward the other side. Allow me to briefly address hatred before returning to the issue of context. Social psychologist Iran Halperin writes, hatred is a closing emotion, a feeling based on a lack of belief in the possibility of change, directed at the fundamental nature of the object of hatred and attributing to malicious intentions and attributing to it malicious intention that will never change or diminish. Thus, hatred, not just trauma, fuels the cultural mindset that have become more accessible, where Israelis perceive themselves as being in an endless war, a fate that is inescapable. Sociologist Amalia Saar, writing from a distance of over a year, highlights how trauma is being exploited through a disproportionate substitution of political discourse with an emotional discourse, thereby fostering ignorance and denying enmity. In her original thesis, she argues, despite the compelling reasons for the national trauma discourse, the question, what purpose does it serve, must be asked. In my view, this discourse, she continues, this discourse facilitates the emotional transformation of the political, serving as a sophisticated mechanism to silence political critique. The silencing, I would add, is especially true for political critiques that seek to address the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, aiming to provide context, prevent violence, and establish peace by replacing violence with politics in its broader sense. Let us pause here to refocus on the task at hand. How does all of this reinforce the Hashemite mentality? Well, when context is absent, the conflict is perceived as fate, an atmospheric condition. Accordingly, and here lies the novelty, endless war, not just an endless conflict, become an inevitable fate. Those who choose endless war will inevitably view international law as an obstacle to be removed. Recall here Ben-Gvir's foundational rationale. We must not comply with the decision that endanger the continuing existence of the state of Israel. We must continue crushing the enemy until total victory. In other words, non-compliance with international law and unrestrained use of force are secondary phenomena derives from the primary phenomenon of embracing total war. On deep reflection, we see the major yet incomplete transition to the logic of decisive victory necessitate both the denial of enmity and the suppression of any discussion of contest, while simultaneously framing the conflict as existential. This is a paradox. How is it resolved? In practice, enmity as a national conflict rooted with physical and earthly explanation is denied, while enmity as an existential conflict rooted in metaphysical causes is recognized. This is not merely the denial of enmity, but the denial of national enmity. I will now move to the next point. In Arabic, there is an expression that states a party to a conflict has left no room for reconciliation. In Arabic, ما خلاش للصلح مطرح. I mention this to argue that if the war is total, there is no need to leave room for reconciliation, which requires dialogue or even the prospects of dialogue. Consequently, there's no obligation to self-impose limitation on the use of force, as would be required by adopting international law. Israel aptly writes on this matter: to avoid turning war into a total existential conflict, one must leave some horizon, however narrow, that can accommodate both sides to this war. From what institutionalized Israel has done during the 8 months since the war began, it does not seem that there is any belief in the need for dialogue or any horizon at all. My time is running out, and I'm still far from addressing the whole cultural configuration that the intersection of the logic of total victory, national trauma, and new militarization has produced. However, before I conclude, I would like to emphasize that the phrase "the Hag Shmak" is also a product of an international Jewish-Israeli struggle and may be a primary causal building block in the series of hypotheses presented here. To explain, in an article that received significant attention in the Zionist left, Uri Tuval wrote that the current war is not only against the other side, but also an internal war designed, as he puts it, to crush its opponents. Tuval explained that joint war against Hamas is simultaneously an internal confrontation involving Hamas, a violent actor, used by both sides in their struggle against each other. Indeed, in October 2022, a survey by the Israeli Democracy Institute showed that the Israeli Jews are split in the issue at hand. About half, 48%, believe that the IDF should ensure the military action do not violate international law and rules of war, while 46% disagree. All of this suggests that the Hag Shman is not a shift in official Israeli stances. Netanyahu's remarks earlier were cited to demonstrate this, but rather a relatively new positioning in the discourse, shaping identity amid an internal Jewish-Israeli struggle over the character, essence, and above all, the purpose of the future state. At this point, the writing of the political sociologist Lev Greenberg is particularly useful. Greenberg argues that there is an internal struggle in Israel between two camps, each adhering to distinct political imagination. The first camp upholds a political imagination of unification and hierarchy. The explicit annexation of Israel and the occupied territories under a civilian regime that denies citizenship to the governed Palestinians, thereby creating an explicit hierarchy among the ruled. This would be a formalization of apartheid, which the international law considered a crime against humanity. Therefore, a culture of contempt and disdain for such laws must be cultivated. This is the Hag Shmak camp. The opposing camp adheres to a political imagination that separates democratic Israel from the occupied territories, with adherence to international law, even if sometimes manipulated through scandalous interpretation of the law, forming part of this identity. This is the High Court as a shield camp, Bagat Shekpot. As a complementary point, and I will end with this, in this struggle, the military, or more precisely, the official military, as Levy called it, associated with the IDF High Command and the Israeli image as a democracy, is invested in the political imagination of separation and the slogan, and accordingly with the slogan, the High Court as a shield. Conversely, the unofficial military, the policing force in the territory and in the occupied territories associated with radical settler zealots, align with the Hag Schmuck camp. In essence, the Hag Schmuck is a cultural master narrative that emerges and intensifies in a dialectical struggle with another master narrative known as the High Court as a shield. In cultural analysis, this suggests that the declarative rejection of international law is part of a process of a meaning-making, boundary work, group-making, and identity work, or in short, identity talk. I have not completed the task. For example, I did not address the weakening democratic institution in Israel, the fragility of the education system, the lack of education for peace and universality, nor did I discuss the erosion of international law at the global order established after the Second World War. However, my time is up, and I must conclude, not before reminding everyone that while we are deliberating these issues, atrocities continue to unfold, and the gates of hell that the Israel government has opened in Gaza threatens to destroy not only the residents of Gaza, but all the inhabitants of this land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meir. We will open it for a discussion. I'll just say at the beginning that, yeah, I think it was important that you did mention at the second part of your presentation that Ben Gvir and Smotrich, with all due respect, come to them, are not representative of the entire Jewish sector. So there are different views there, and I think the second part was important in this respect. It seems to me that the issue that you did not refer has to do with the whole concern of lack of symmetry and the perception, either justified or not, of many among the Jews in Israel that these rules of international law apply only on one side. And it's, again, one may disagree with this perception, but it's something that may explain, even if not justify the position. And in this respect, there is this notion that you may want to address of lawfare, of using law as a means to harm the Israeli interest and things like that. Again, these are aspects that I think are debatable whether they are justified or not, but they may explain part of this reluctance to refer to international law as binding or as important. And this is separate from the entire concern that you mentioned in the last part of your presentation about the internal conflict in Israel about the very notion of the rule of law. There is a camp, about 1/2 probably of the Israeli population, that is not willing to accept constraints, that majority should prevail regardless of any limitations on human rights and other constraints about rules of the game. And it is translated here, but as I think you rightly mentioned, the reluctance or the disappointment from international law goes beyond this camp that questions the rule of law. So I think that we'll take a few questions, then you will respond, and then we'll take another round of questions. I guess, Aitan, please.
So, I'm going to echo, I think, a bit of what Barak just said, but maybe just frame it slightly differently. So, as both of you actually pointed out, there isn't a uniform kind of approach within, I suppose, in any society, and also here. I think, in a way, this kind of distinction that you made between Ben Gurion's Shmum and Smotrich's Hag Shman can reflect something that I think still exists within Harvard, and Barak kind of indicated. So I think, and we see it even in the discussion that we've had in this forum, there is an approach, as Barak was mentioning, that is concerned in a way, as Ben Gurion seemed to be, about, at least in a generous interpretation, about the institutions. So there's a concern that the law is applied in we often have a reference to bias. That might connect to the point that you were making about the diaspora experiences of Jews, where they lived in places that had a formal commitment to equality, or they didn't experience it. So this is an approach that doesn't dismiss the norms. It believes in the norms, in international norms. Its concern is about the way they're applied, or this apparent or alleged bias in the way they're applied. So I mean, I think like NGO Monitor, that's the kind of line of argumentation that they raise most of the time. It's calling out a bias. They're not saying it shouldn't be human rights, but I don't come off like a defender of NGO Monitor, but just to, that's the one side. The other, the Hag Shmag, at least as expressed by Smotrich, I think, and half of the Israeli population, perhaps more, seem to reflect that approach, is an approach that is dismissive of the norms. It doesn't accept. So, I mean, I don't think it's also just coming, certainly not from Smotrich's camp, just from the 7th of October. It's a camp that has a different set of normative commitments, and international law, and maybe they overlap in some cases, but very little. And the whole approach to international law is that that's not our thing. That's an alien normative system. And so I think that's quite a distinct difference between these two camps.
Dave.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amir. And I'm wondering how much this is unique to Israel. I spent a lot of time with people from Serbia, and what you are suggesting exactly exists there. And it was largely, first and foremost, a function of the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia. As soon as they saw that they were being targeted, any drop of any persuasion of any commitment to international law dissipated. And so I think that from that point of view, there's a bit of a paradox in the International Criminal Court as well, because it may be an advance from international point of view, but from domestically, we know in those states, as people have been brought before international courts, it reduces the support for international courts and for international law in general.
Thanks very much. So I was going to make a kind of similar, a comment along a similar line to Eitan's. And I mean, I was reflecting in some sense, because you were talking about Ben Gurion, on the fact that Israel signed the Genocide Convention, right, and ratified it, and in fact incorporated it into Israeli law. We know, the various authorities decided thus far not to invoke it in criminal cases, but it's possible to do so, right? And has done other things like the Refugee Convention as one of the first signatories. So for me, and somebody who lives in the UK for a while, I see a degree of parallel, and it relates to it, but it's slightly tangent to it, which is we want to be part of these systems. We think those rules are important, but they're actually not entirely meant for us. So the idea that we signed the Genocide Convention, but of course it's to prevent things like the thing that happened to us, rather than things that we might be ever accused of doing with refugees. The same, and I see this in the UK in relation to the European Convention of Human Rights. We draft this, but of course we will never need it. It's for others. So I wonder what element of that play as well. That the rules, it's not just that the rules are perhaps used in a biased way. It's almost like there's the perception that we can never be accused of crimes that are as heinous as the ones that have been committed to us against us. And in a way, even accusing us of that is itself a degree of inversion of Holocaust inversion and other things.
Thanks. So we will let Amir respond, and then we'll take another round.
Thank you. Okay, I will give very short answers, because mainly because I have to think about your questions. It's absolutely a good material to reflect on. if it exists only in Serbia, I think it validates the phenomenon. So it
No, I'm just giving Serbia as one example. I haven't tested other countries. One country I do know. It's very strong.
but to be clear, I don't argue that this is exclusively for Israel. It's not part of packages. So it will be interesting to compare and contrast between the two cases. That it has sociological roots, ideational roots, identity-based roots. Yes, of course. Yes, of course. This is the pre-assumption of a cultural analysis, that this is not only something that rooted in realms of normative laws or legality, but in terms of collective self-meaning, collective self-image. So this is why we need to understand the cultural roots of this, what I've called here some kind of a boundary work, that when you say Hagshma, you are self-locating yourself in an internal societal conflict or meaning making or boundary work that wants to mark the boundary between ourselves and the outside group. So I entirely agree that it has a sociological basis. Quite interestingly, the camp that expresses disdain to international law, if I'm not right, does not justify it by the logic that it's afraid that it has asymmetry. Okay, he doesn't use this mode of rationalization. It's interesting. This is it needs a more rigorous inspection, but it doesn't use this mode of rationalization. Who uses this mode of rationalization is the camp that declaratively adhere to international law, but continues to mention every time that, and I remember Bughi Yalona, the second Intifada, saying that these wars have been written in certain condition in the history in the Second World War. It is not suitable. But Bughi Yalon is the one that coined the term Bagat Shahbaz. He's in this camp. So this camp is more this modes of rationalization or justification regime is more associated with this camp.
Thank you very much, Amir. This is great. Two quick questions. One, we spoke about, in terms of context, global context, you said something about global erosion of the rule of law. I mean, do you connect also what is happening at least in the last decade to populism? Because this idea of even Hagshma, I mean, those who follow the American discourse have, the Americans have adopted the Hague Invasion Act. So they actually have a law on the books that, according to some interpretations, allow them to use force to release Americans detained. And the Trump administration, the previous one, was quite keen on withdrawing from almost every treaty that the United States had. And there was this famous quote by John Bolton that if 10 floors would disappear from the UN building, there would be no difference to the state of the world. So you have this rhetoric, and there are other examples. So whether the Israeli discourse is influenced or is being mirrors this discourse. And the second point, historically, Rovi mentioned the Genocide Convention. So we have within Jewish Israel, we have this narrative that Jews were historically very keen to support international law because international law defended minority rights. And the question, you focus very much on the Jewish majority, but is the research on the Arab minority in Israel and its position towards international law, does it have some resemblance to the ways in which Jews have approached international law in earlier times in history?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, basically. Thank you. it's very brave for you to engage with such a complex presentation. So I admire your encouragement to present.
Thank you.
And I also want to follow your example to take risks for on the other side to make a bold observation.
Yes.
So you critique the phenomena of like this law, international law, right, in the Israeli discourse, particularly about the politicians. So I want to make a distinction because the politicians, none of them are trained in an intellectual way to engage in the legal discussion. So I want to defend them. Maybe what they really target is a failure of the international institutions to implement international law. For example, the ICC and the United States, because the spirit of the law is different from the spirit of the organizations or people emphasizing or implementing that. I want to take an example of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Middle East. It's clear that they did not do a good job. For example, they implementing the textbook with anti-Semitism materials indoctrinating the next generations of Palestinians. So that is it is true, right? So that's an effort to perpetuating the conflict. So, I think the politicians, they when they comment about the international law, actually it's based on all the facts of the organizations who implement, who are supposed to guard the international law, but actually still implement it.
Thank you. Thank you. I will take two last comments and then you'll be able to respond just in a minute. So Moshe and then Ron.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I really like it. I would like to add something. I think that in the Israeli political culture, there has been always two streams in our culture. One of them is virtue isolationist, and one was quite cosmopolitical. Yeah, cosmopolitical. Let's say every year we commemorate the partition resolution of the UN General Assembly. Every year we commemorate the International Holocaust Day, again, pronounced by the General Assembly. But we have always these two streams, but after October 7th, something happened. And let's just say it's not only a trauma, it is also a cultural shock, and I think that this Hag has been greatly intensified, but it may change in the future. Just for example, if the ICJ would say 2 years from now that Israel did not commit a genocide, if there will be a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia and so on. So perhaps the balance between these two streams may change.
Okay. And lastly, Ron, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Amir. It was really interesting and looking forward to the written article. Ron is a colleague who told me that the Bankers it was writing your book. So further constructing the Hag Shmag, I think the way in spoken Hebrew right now, it has actually two distinct meanings. One of them is Hag is useless. They're never going to arrest us. They can't enforce it. The US will protect us. Trump is in power. As you well said, it's part of the erosion of international law. Russia invaded Ukraine. I think they can't touch us. It's the Yanda. Russia is under severe sanctions.
Me?
Russia is under severe sanctions.
No, I'm talking about the narrative, not about the reality. So it's useless. They can't touch us. Smart, yeah. And the other one is they have no authority to condemn us normatively. It's who they are to tell us, who they are to preach us. And the two can be in tension, because if it's useless, it's not threatening. And if it's part of a massive anti-Semitic conspiracy, it's very threatening. And I think you can sense it that sometimes in the media, the threat is exaggerated. Thousands of soldiers will be arrested in Thailand and so on, which we know would not happen. And sometimes come out, they can't touch us. Trump will invade the Hague and so on. I think for Bengal, it's both. But the other comment I want to say, I think none of it is coming from the military. at least from the higher echelon of the military and the security establishments. They are worried about the rest, and they don't dismiss the normative power necessarily. And I think that this is why I think I disagree with you, but I definitely disagree with Yair Levy, if I may. I think Israel is not becoming more militaristic, it's becoming less militaristic with the war. Because Ben Gvir and what he is representing is against the military. You know, he's against the army. We have a minister of national security who didn't serve in the army. For him, the army are the enemy. Look at all the conspiracy theory against the military. We used to have a slogan, "Tnu letzahal lenatzach," let the IDF win, which assumed the IDF could win, but the lawyers and Bagatz and B'Tselem are stopping. Now they're saying the army doesn't want to. If you read Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Tali Gottlieb and these kind of people, which are not hegemonic in any way, but they're strong, they're blaming the army. The army is the lefty, the Ashkenazi pilots and so on. So I think Hak Shmad is not representing the military, it's representing Ben Gvirism. I think the army, the IDF has more lawyers per capita than any other institution, and they take it seriously. So I think the Hak Shmad is not, Herzi Levy is not saying Hak Shmad, and it's not about protecting him or anything, but I think we need to be more accurate in that.
Thank you.
Wow.
Please be brief because we are out of time.
First of all, thank you a lot for this remarks and enlightening questions. I will surely take it with me. The populism trend around the world and the phenomenon that I've tried to describe, of course, there's a link intuitively. There's a strong link, and more than intuitively. If populism, one of the populist characteristics is an attack on experts, including experts of law. So there is almost a compelling link between the two. Arabs and the international law. In the same survey that I mentioned, 83% of the Arabs in Israel answered that the IDF should comply with international law. It's not surprising. In the broader perspective, the Arab political elite and some part of the intellectual elite chosen the strategy of internalization of the status in terms of adopting the language of international law. They were a lot disappointed. For example, when they went to the United Nations after the nationality law, and they replied that this is an internal issue. However, there is a heated debate going on since the beginning of the 2000 about how to internationalize the status of the Arab Palestinian national minority in Israel. I've written a paper on this a decade ago, and it was very, very relevant back then. Ben-Gurion versus Shoret. Yes, Ben-Gurion versus Shoret. It's a very known debate camps within the literature. Some highlight the difference. Some say there is not really difference. It's only discursive one that Shoret overestimated Ben-Gurion for his own interest. And of course, when I said that I'm using the cultural analysis method, I've said culture is a repertoire of meaning making or perspectives about the world, which has not only different values or lenses to reality, but also conflicting and fluid. So it can change by. First, I'm real following the steps of Swindler, Lemon. It can change by exogenous elements. Hag Shmag has two meanings. I agree. I will also let Yair answer your critique. However, I think when he said militarism, in the broader sense of militarism, as a culture, as a mode of rationalization, and lenses to reality, not necessarily in its organizational limitations. So here you're more going to the militarism as military officer. So militarism is a cognitive schema, is a interpretive schema. So not on track. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amir.